terrorists. If we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit,
it is vital that we win the propaganda war.
Make no mistake, this was a terrorist attack.
Welcome to Extreme Calls, the podcast where you learn about extremist communications and propaganda. My name is Stefan Bale from the University of Exeter, and today we look at the propaganda system of Nazi Germany. The inexorable rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s went hand in hand with a sharp understanding of the power of propaganda and the immense potential of the then new media, cinema, radio, in shaping audiences' perceptions of reality and their political preferences. The propaganda machine aggressively set up by the Nazis had so many layers and ramifications and was so modern in its implementation that still today, when people hear the word propaganda, they think of the National Socialist regime and its indoctrination maestro, Joseph Goebbels. And this is why we dedicate this Extreme Calls to it.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and incite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet.
To ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.
And to do so, we are here with Aristotle Kallis, who is professor at Keele University, and he's the author of a range of books on the interwar period in Europe, the rise of fascism at that time, but also Nazi propaganda more specifically. So I can single out a couple of books. The volume edited with Antonio Costa Pinto, for example, Rethinking Fascism and Dictatorship in Europe, but also some monographs, chiefly I would mention Genocide and Fascism, the Eliminationist Drive in Fascist Europe, and perhaps more importantly for today's discussion, Nazi Propaganda and the Second World War, a fascinating book that I really recommend our audience to go and read. So Aristotle, welcome and thank you very much for taking part in this call.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. Introductions always make me very nervous because I barely recognize the place that the person that people talk about. So anyway, thanks very much. It was a very nice introduction.
It's very kind of you. And I would like to start with something a little bit on the side, a more personal question. I'm always interested to hear about people's intellectual journeys, about how they came to study what they are conducting research on. So could you briefly explain how you came to focus your research on something, as dark as that interwar period, the rise of fascism and Nazi propaganda and ideology?
I mean, this is the kind of question that I suppose a more engineered answer would have been in a form of ego-histoire, that I was basically almost born intellectually with this kind of burning desire to research fascism and genocide and mass violence. And it was all part of a predetermined narrative. I'm afraid it wasn't. A lot of these things, one of my heroes in history is, in terms of historical methodologies, Michel Foucault. And I would say that actually, I am more like a genealogy of what I am. It kind of twists and turns and things that were contingent, pretty much like history in that respect. So I always had a personal interest in the interwar period, but it started as a positive interest. I was interested in the art of the 1920s. I was interested in the architecture. I'm a bit of a modernist freak myself. So, you know, my entry point into the 1920s and 30s was actually a very positive one. And then at university, we all have our stories from university. I have a lot of I should be careful, not very positive stories, but I have two very positive stories. And one of them was one of my professors at the university in Athens, who told me to research something about visual politics in Nazi Germany, which, you know, at the time as a student, you do what you're told. And in Greece back then anyway, I did it and I found it fascinating. And from that, a chain of events, I always wanted to do comparative history. It's one of those things that absolutely fascinate me. And it's interesting that I say this because one of the books you mentioned is the National Socialist Propaganda is actually not a comparative one, but it was my first one. So it was a little bit of my first non-comparative one, as it were. So it was a bit of an experiment. But I started researching that big comparison between Italy and Germany. I was always fascinated by this, the two regimes. And I suppose at the very heart of my interest in these darker sides of the interwar period was this interest in understanding not only that this happened and tracing the story of it, but understanding its appeal. And that applies to anything, the ideology, but also the more extreme what happened, the more interesting the question of why it could appeal. So it's a kind of a bit of a story, really. And the final thing I would say with regard to this particular book, for example, is started from my teaching. I was asked to teach a course on propaganda as a young lecturer back then. And I thought, oh, propaganda, you know, whatever. So I started reading about this and teaching it. And I find it fascinating. And like all of us, and I'm sure you would agree with me, students are always co-authors of our books. You know, they give us ideas, they give us food for thought on an everyday basis. So a bit of a mixed picture, really, in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's the case for, you know, for most of us, the kind of dynamics that you describe. And so let's get into these darker, subjects that you were somehow led to investigate. This interview today really centers on Nazi propaganda. That's what we're going to talk about. And before addressing more particular and specific aspects of Nazi propaganda, I think it's useful to kind of set the stage and clarify what we are talking about. Would it be possible for you to briefly kind of summarize what was the propaganda of Nazi Germany? How can we define it? What were the kind of very major characteristics before we kind of go into more specifics?
The early questions are usually the most difficult one because they're the broader brush ones, aren't they? One of the reasons why I found this subject while I was researching it and writing the book so fascinating was that we all come in the West post-war armed with this understanding of Nazism as something really exceptional, something out of the norm. And of course, you know, yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day. There are a lot of things that you can say were really unique about National Socialism. But as I was studying propaganda, and you know, the normal narrative about this is that Nazi propaganda was something weird, something rogue, something out of the radar, if you like, of everything. I actually started thinking that this is probably not true. At the end, at the heart of what the Nazis were doing was propaganda. So you use the term Nazi propaganda as if, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but somebody could think that there is something special about this. And I would say, let's go a step back. Nazis were engaged in propaganda in not fundamentally dissimilar ways to the ways in which other political regimes and political authorities have been engaging with propaganda a little bit before and definitely since. Now, I don't want to over-egg that particular comparison. I don't want to say that it's the same. No. But what I found really, really striking, because I decided to write the book on the World War II period, okay? So I'm not so much talking about 1920s or early to mid 1930s. I'm talking mostly about the Second World War. What I found by accident, as it were, is I was looking at Nazi propaganda during the war, and then I was looking at British propaganda, because every now and then you get into this, and you realize that a lot of things that you take for granted in a democracy go out of the window during the war. So somehow these exceptional circumstances create governments that govern in a very authoritarian way, censorship that you wouldn't accept in a democratic society, but suddenly you do. And at the end of the day, what I found very, very interesting as a starting point is that Nazi propaganda was propaganda. And what do I mean by this? It is a technique of communication and persuasion. And again, without wanting to overextend that kind of similarity, that is far more prevalent in our everyday lives, and even in our lives as citizens of free, democratic, liberal societies and so on, than we actually think. The sort of idea that there is somebody who wants to effect a change in the behavior of a group of people. The means that they use it, it's a particular kind of way of talking about something, it's a particular kind of framing what you're talking so that it makes sense, doesn't come out of the blue. And in that respect, Nazi propaganda to me, it's pretty much propaganda 101. And it's the kind of propaganda that it's not exclusive to totalitarian regimes or some kind of rogue dark moments of the 20th century. Where it gets different is that if we analyze it in the context of the ideology and the political structures that generated it. So Nazi propaganda, for example, yes, communication, yes, persuasion, and so on. It was very heavily invested in Hitler's charismatic authority, which I find quite different. It kind of brings it closer to propaganda used by regimes that are either totalitarian, sort of a Soviet Union and so on, or dictatorships that are very personality driven. So in that respect, it was actually a very, very specific kind of communication strategies, heavily investing on not the political authority of the leader, but on this charisma, which goes above rational persuasion. It's a kind of much more an emotive community in that respect. Also, what I would say, where it was different as a communication technique was that, and I think I am overgeneralizing here, but it is true, it was a total propaganda. So it was a propaganda, it was a communication strategy that was not geared to influence people and then allow them some space to make their own decisions. It was a kind of propaganda that was spreading everywhere, that was entering into different spheres of life, not just the purely political or the informational, but the recreational, the leisure, the more subtle. And I think in that respect, it was quite different. Another very important difference, I would say, is the message. Of course, propaganda as communication is always about selling a message, but the message here was quite singular, whether it is the hatred of the Jews or the ideas of the conspiracy or the sense of entitlement that it was trying to cultivate in Germans about, Lebensraum and so on and so forth. It was all very important. The final point, though, and this is usually the one that we use a lot, and it is true to a large extent, Nazi propaganda was in a way a little bit unique, and I don't like using that term, because it was one of the firsts that made such extensive and effective use of what we may call modernity in communication. It's not the first to use individual things, but put them together into an ensemble that I think understood the audience in a way that politicians hadn't done before.
And that, I think it's that's a thought that I'd like people to keep, our audience to keep in mind, because I will use that in one of the very last question of today, because I see parallels there between that kind of understanding and use that you explain about Nazi Germany and what we have seen and what I have researched on in terms of the so-called Islamic State. But let's put that in a bracket for the moment.
Yeah.
And and I think my second question builds a little bit on that kind of misunderstanding that you talk about Nazi Germany propaganda as being something totally unique, something out of the blue, because I think it taps into a popular understanding. I think, I'm not sure, but something that I've heard in discussions with students and other people interested in that it was a propaganda system that was very heavily centralized and all-powerful. Kind of immediately they were pulling the strings and everything was falling into places, kind of approach. What I took from your book is that the reality was more complex than that, and you describe it quite well, the extent to which this was actually true or not. So to what extent is this representation of Nazi Germany propaganda as a sort of fully centralized, fully accomplished propaganda system accurate? And maybe also, if I can bounce on this, and that would be kind of a sub question. Have we seen evolutions in the propaganda in the 1930s and 1940s during the war? Have we seen an evolution towards less or more centralization, cooperation? Can you tell us a little bit about the organization, in other words?
I mean, think of the way in which we talk about sort of in everyday parlance, but also the more traditional scholarship. I'm talking about the post-war 50s, 60s, 70s scholarship about National Socialism. Think about this kind of cliche expressions we're using. We're talking about, people were brainwashed. National Socialism as some kind of infection of the mind, the kind of contagion that suddenly people lost their rational faculties. You have historians post-war, German historians, Italian historians, in pretty much every country, who, in trying to justify what happened in the 1930s, they came up with all these schemata and saying, I'm thinking of Friedrich Meinecke, for example, in Germany, who was talking about a disease that somehow infected people. And, all that kind of language is exceptionalizing National Socialism. And you see it in everything. Propaganda is one example I used. Let's take another quick example. Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. It's always being conventionally portrayed as this kind of octopus. Really, I remember one of my favorite books on that topic is this kind of omnipresent, omniscient, it kind of knew everything, was everywhere, could do anything. And of course, if you, as you say, zoom a little bit in, it's complicated. It wasn't. So when it comes to Nazi propaganda, what do we find? We find quite a lot of centralization. That is true. I mean, we talk a lot of Nazi propaganda instantly. The first person that comes, we know that, is Dr. Joseph Goebbels. There's a reason for it. Not only was he absolutely critical in streamlining Nazi propaganda on the party level in the second half of the 1920s, when the Nazi Party was a failing startup. They were a bunch of losers, okay? They were not doing anything, no votes, no money, nothing at all. So he was very important in that respect, but he was also very important. I think that's the first pressure point, 1933, because that's the big jump. The Nazi regime stops being a mass movement and becomes constituted power. Okay, that is it. And of course, Goebbels, in theory, what should have happened is he would have been the maestro. He always liked this kind of analogy. Propaganda is like an orchestra. There's a maestro. He fashioned himself as a maestro, but of course, you rely on your instruments. You rely on on the soloists, you relied on the overall sound of the orchestra, and he would be there sort of conducting it. That was the plan. He created the Ministry of Propaganda, popular enlightenment, as it were, but it's thing, and he tried to centralize everything. So press, political messaging, mass media, and so on and so forth. In theory. In practice, you talked about ups and downs. 1933 was his kind of peak, 1933-34. 1934 onwards, I mean, he was a manager in many ways. He wanted something much closer to a CEO of a company that we recognize today. That's not how the Nazi regime was working. Hitler was all over the place. He believed this kind of charismatic authority. Everything that the Nazi regime was doing was Hitler Befehl, the wish or the order of Hitler. And if Hitler wanted to appoint somebody else doing something else, that was it. Nobody would take issue. And of course, by 1937-38, control is slipping from Goebbels. There are certain other people dealing with press. Other people are dealing with the policy message. 37-38 are really dark years for Goebbels. He's almost eclipsed. You have new stars like Joachim von Ribbentrop, who is the new foreign minister, who becomes this kind of really important person, and his cronies within the party. So 37-38, Goebbels is almost shaded out of the picture, as it were. Nazi propaganda is being run almost like a feudal system, small clusters of almost complete authority. So press is being run almost in a bubble, radio is being run almost in a bubble, and so on. Not what Goebbels had in mind. And it's really only, so I said 1933 was the peak of Goebbels. He had a second peak. It's really only in 43-45 where the whole thing comes crashing down, where Hitler feels betrayed by all these other people, that Goebbels suddenly finds himself in the center of the whole thing. And in some respects, he is regaining control of that propaganda machinery. Of course, it's a failing propaganda machinery by that time because everything is going wrong. But towards the end, at least, he comes close to that more centralized, more coordinated approach. But in between, I used in the book this kind of feudal analogy quite a lot. You have a weak center, like in an old feudal system, a weak figure, and then in every little corner of that empire, everybody's doing pretty much what they like because they're there because of Hitler's wish, and they can bypass Goebbels and go directly to Hitler. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess. I don't want to exaggerate the mess in terms of the message. It's still a pretty neat propaganda machinery. But if you look in the backstage, people are fighting against each other. Goebbels is losing control. People are not operating like an orchestra. It's almost like they're playing their own instrument, no matter what the others are doing.
So that's a very different account than the one we kind of intuitively have in mind about this propaganda. And what would you say about, nonetheless, the reach of that propaganda? Because it might be fragmented. You might have a lot of rivalries, and something that springs to my mind that you haven't mentioned, but maybe it's important. It's also the rise of the SS in the system. Maybe that impacted to the tone, but also nonetheless fragmented. But yet the reach of the propaganda was very big. No, what wasn't it?
It was exceptionally big, and again, the foundations for that system was set in 1933-34. I consider these 2 years very important, although I do not deal very much with them because, as I said, my main emphasis is 39-45. But these are the 2 years where, if you like, the regime itself sets up the basic parameters of its operation. Okay, so almost immediately upon Hitler coming to power, and then Goebbels, of course, being in charge of this, newspapers closed down, parties closed down, everything is centralized in that respect. So there is no alternative truth. There is no alternative voice. The Nazi regime becomes very, very quickly the gatekeeper of truth. So imagine this. Of course, it's very difficult for us today because in an era of social media, there's no analogy anymore. We kind of, I remember the time where there was no social media and, you listen to the newspaper, you listen to the television, or you read the newspaper, and they were a bit of a gatekeepers of truth. So they told you what happened, and they could refract the message a bit, depending on their political persuasion or whatever. Now, of course, there's no gatekeeper. Everybody, has a Twitter account and is, I don't know, somebody quite successful can just start blaring all these kind of things. But back then, the regime was the only gatekeeper. Everything that was sold to the public as the truth had to go through it. And in that respect, the Nazi regime was very successful. Absolutely. It set the structures for this kind of thing. And I would say one more thing was very successful, what they did. And for that, Goebbels has to take credit, if ever that was the right way to talk about it. But I made the point about the modernity of the Nazi regime. And I think that goes on a number of different levels, the technology and everything. But one very important thing that Goebbels realized was that propaganda is at its most effective when it's pushing a half-open door. So when it speaks to something that the people already like or fear or believe, it's there. Because if it's something completely unrelated to the people, no matter how well you set it up, how nicely you present it or whatever, it's not going to cut it, because people saying, whatever, this is not something I can relate to. But if you appeal to that inner side of the human, whether it is something that they believe or something that they want to believe, but they can't really externalize it, that's what he did. And he did something else. He understood that propaganda is trial and error. He had the as it were, the humility in that respect to know that it's very likely that when you're planning propaganda, you'll get it wrong. So what's the best way to deal with this? First of all, to learn from your mistakes. But how do you know whether something worked or not? He set up the most elaborate system of benchmarking the propaganda campaigns. So here comes the message. You launch the message. It goes out, whether it is newspapers or it's cinema, which is very important in this situation and everything. And then there was a whole system, formal and informal, of, if you like, opinion polling. It wasn't opinion polling, that they weren't going around asking people what they thought. For example, I use that a lot in my students. There was a new film that, of course, film was very much centralized, and Goebbels believed strongly in film. And there was a film with a political message. So it would be launched, and then the propaganda ministry would plant informers in the audience to listen to what people were saying during and after the film. And all that was fed back through these weekly reports, which are one of the major sources of the historians of Nazi propaganda. So they would look at the result, and sometimes you could see those reports, they're really honest because they're internal documents. They're written for the propaganda ministry. This worked, this beautifully worked, whatever. This was rubbish. It didn't cut it, okay? And then there would be recalibrations, trial and error, or as Beckett used to say, try, fail, trial again, fail better. But that was very much built into what Goebbels was doing in that respect. All this together, you have a system that is geared to reach as widely as possible, but also to be agile, to adjust itself to maximize its efficiency.
It's almost, it sounds almost like a sort of hidden focus group system, right? Just to listen to
without them knowing,
except they don't know, right? Yeah. What I so when I read your work, especially your book on Nazi propaganda, and especially actually a chapter of it that I assigned to my class, which is, I think, for me, the most interesting chapter, but people have their own interests, is a chapter which I found useful because you dissect the what you call the discourses of Nazi propaganda, and you use two concepts to do that. So basically, what they talk about, right? Two concepts that I found enlightening. The first concept is long-term emplotment, and the other one is short-term justification. Could you summarize perhaps this analysis here? Because I found it particularly enlightening. So why is it important to, when you study that propaganda, to try to highlight in the discourse, in the themes, in the ideas, the long-term emplotment and the short-term justifications?
I have to say, I feel sorry having looked at this after what is now 12, 13 years since I wrote it. I mean, emplotment is probably not the most user-friendly word. It's quite a heavily slanted, jargonistic, almost linguistic term. But I'm going to come to this in a moment. Let me start with the adjective in both. I mean, clearly that kind of chapter you're talking about is based on a distinction between long-term cycles and short-term cycles. And I think that is important for propaganda. It kind of speaks to what we were saying earlier on, to what I was saying earlier on. In constructing a propaganda message, okay, the propagandist, let's put it this way, has got a brief. They have a goal to achieve in terms of persuasion, but that persuasion is very targeted. It's kind of something that needs to go to a particular audience at a particular point in time, okay? So, and then the propagandist thinks, okay, I've got these tools and I'm going to use these tools and I'm going to phrase in this way and I'm going to communicate it through this media and everything, okay? So this kind of short-term and long-term dimension is very important in that respect, because although a propaganda campaign has a short-term horizon, so it deals with a problem, it deals with an objective, it tries to promote an objective, it tries to facilitate an objective. I'm going to use a couple of examples very, very briefly in a moment. But while the short-term function is important, that propaganda campaign, that specific thing you're doing, is part of a wider discourse and is part of a wider narrative that you want to create about, let's say in that case, a political authority, a political regime, and so on and so forth. Not only that, it actually acts as an amplifier of the message, because essentially what this long-term dimension does is it adds purpose and a sense of direction and a sense of significance to something quite small by inscribing in a much longer view of who we are, where we want to go to. So emplotment is, I mean,
Would there be a better word now if you had to choose another word? No.
To be honest, I really like emplotment because it actually has this idea of putting it inside something and creating a plot about it. I love this word, but I know it's a little bit difficult. I mean, framing is another way of putting it. Okay, it's the kind of long-term framing. It's basically, how do you say that? I'm going to take an example from the book as well, which is a very important turning point anyway. The defeat of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad in 1943. Okay, that is a climactic event. Okay, it's the beginning. It's the beginning of the end. So you have to construct a propaganda message that deals with this particular bit of news, okay? So in the short term, you need to create a message that makes that kind of very sad and contrary event acceptable, communicable, understandable to the people, okay? So, you know, the way in which they did it is that they staged this live recording, which of course it wasn't, but so on and so forth. Here we are going to go straight into Stalingrad, and a few days later you play the music and you say, what do you say? You say, we lost, it was all a sacrifice of the beautiful German soldiers for the good of the nation. And then suddenly you open it up. It becomes a battle in a war of Germany against the primordial enemy of the Judeo-Bolshevik international conspiracy, that even if at this particular moment we faced a little bit of a backlash, a little bit of a setback, as it were, it's part of a wider campaign that we will win. And also, let us pause for a moment and celebrate the self-sacrifice of the German soldier. So suddenly, that piece of terrible news, which is we lost, and we lost really, really badly, becomes a moral story for something much deeper, much longer term, much more important and significant that enhances the message itself. So in that respect, the employment is absolutely necessary. And I tell you something, I always found this last 2.5 years of Nazi propaganda by far the most interesting, i.e. mid-43 to 45. And I chose the war period because to me, it's like the two sides. 1939 to 42, everything pretty much goes according to plan. Every bit, it's almost like they can't go wrong. They attack this, they win. They attack that, they win. They do this, they win. They do that, they win. Everything is going beautifully. It's easy to sell propaganda like this, okay? It's easy. I mean, you've got good news. They had, we're winning. Here's your short-term justification. We won. Here's the long-term. We're going to be triumphant again. But 43, 45, there are no good news. So you have to deal with the bad news. You cannot hide them anymore because at some point you have to tell them there's no good news. And what do you do in that case? This is where you try to create this broader stories. And this is what the long-term employment is so important. Take that bit of information that you are communicating at that particular point and make it a part of a much more meaningful journey and say to the people, it happens now, and this is part of what we're trying to do. So suddenly it opens up, it becomes important, it becomes significant, even if it's bad news, in which case, and 43, 44, you create a longer story to make this bad news more acceptable to your public in that respect. So justification in the short term is important. You want to sell the message, but long-term employment, this kind of broader story, enhances the message, increases its appeal and its reach and its power to persuade, or at least, if not to persuade convincingly, positively, to stop people from doing something silly, which is turning against the regime, which was very important towards the end.
Yeah, another example of that that you use in the book that I found enlightening is the so you talk about the challenge here of framing and talking about negative event, but another kind of dent in the nicely streamed propaganda of the good times that you talk about in the book is when they launched the surprise attack of the Soviet Union, because it's formerly an ally. So in the early stage of propaganda, Bolshevism and Marxism is kind of the enemy. It's constructed in a way that explains that it's a construct of course, the Jews. And then that kind of, when they sign the non-aggression pact, all that has to go all of a sudden. They had to kind of reinvent the grand, the long-term employment, but I think the narrative, it has to change, and then it kind of falls back earlier to the earlier kind of construct and narrative when they invade Russia. I think that was also a good example.
And what's very interesting with regard to this episode is that not only is there a change of narrative, obviously in 1939, everything stops. I mean, there are all these stories. There were films in production that had an anti-communist, anti-Soviet message. And they were very much basically stopped. The production just stopped. That was it. And I think it's very important. But what's happening in 41? The message is that what was happening during the past 2 years was an absolutely necessary what's the word, kind of concession that Hitler and the regime did, not because they wanted, they absolutely hated it, but they did it for the good of the country. It was strategically right to do it. And now they're suddenly liberated. And Hitler used it quite a lot. And the propaganda message was that, you know, it made sense in 1939 to make this agreement, but we have been let down, we have been betrayed, and at the same time, now we're back, we are reconnecting to our ideological roots. So you can imagine how this longer term story suddenly makes the swift change much more acceptable, much more understandable, because if you look at it, June 1941, no mention. July 1941, of course, you know, you get into this, the enemies, the Bolsheviks and everything. It makes no sense. How can you sell that? But employment is very much part of that story. Yeah.
I still have a few questions. I mean, it's such a fascinating, of course, case, and as you said, a case that had a lot of consequences afterwards in terms of the history of propaganda. One aspect I'm keen to get your impressions of is the ability of Nazi propagandists or their efforts not only to shape people's ideas about politics when they talk about political news, right, such as or the war, such as the invasion of Russia or Stalingrad, but also to have their message permeate every corner of people's lives. So leisure, free time, hobbies. When we read the sort of classic propaganda, scholars of propaganda, the name that springs to my mind here on this point is Jacques Ellul, for example. It's all about defining propaganda not just as directing the news about things that are happening in the world, but it's also about shaping how people think when they don't think that they are actually constructing political beliefs, right? So in their free time, their leisure and stuff like that. Can you briefly a little bit summarize or bring a couple of elements of how that worked, if it worked in Nazi Germany?
It worked beautifully. And in many ways, if you look at the classical theories of totalitarianism, one of the major characteristics of the whole sort of concept of totalitarianism is exactly that kind of cancellation of the distinction between private and public. So, you know, you would expect in normal circumstances to, you know, every human being has got a public persona. They exist in a political sphere in that respect. But I'm talking about 20th century mostly here. Our idea is that the private sphere is a different sphere, and there is a threshold between the two. But of course, what you get in a totalitarian regime is that kind of distinction becomes almost non-existent, because you can never be sure that you are in a private space where you have no accountability. At the end of the day, that's what it is. In a public sphere, you are accountable for what you're doing. In a private sphere, you are far less accountable because you're far less visible, and so on and so forth. And the Nazis understood this. Again, it's part of their modern approach to communication. It's about selling a message. It's about promoting a message. And how do you do that? The easy way to think about it is, let's blast it out. Let's keep saying newspapers, newsreel, political broadcasting, and so on and so forth. Is that effective? No. It isn't effective, because after a while people get tired. They see the message as too transparent. They start, even if they cannot voice opposition to it, they start rejecting that message, becoming, if you like, more insulated in that respect. So what do? You have these other tools. And again, Goebbels' orchestra principle comes into this discussion again. So you have the heavy-handed political stuff, which is political speeches, party days, Hitler's birthday, kind of all these sort of things, films that show political events and everything. And then you get into the second layer, which is the most subtle one, radio. It's no coincidence that the Nazis pioneered that kind of message of having a cheap radio installed in every house. Why? Because that is the easiest way in which to channel message in a different way, in a lighter, more subtle way. And then private life is also saturated by this. Think of cinema, again, a massively important area for Goebbels and for Nazi propaganda as a whole. And even within cinema, now you can say cinema is a leisure activity. Well, not really. Back then, of course, newsreel is your main way. Television is not a prevailing mass medium, although the Nazis work in that direction as well. But how do you get information? How do you inform the public about what happened in a sort of more spectacular, more visual way? Well, when you go to a film, to watch a film, which could be a film about a love story or whatever, the first 10, 15 minutes are newsreel. So you learn about what happened in the last week, in the last 2 weeks, and so on and so forth. So you kind of balance the two. If you look at what Goebbels was producing, some films were more political and propagandistic, and some were innocuous, innocent love stories, so historical films, innocent, not at all. It was just a kind of much more subtle, much more implicit message that I think was fascinating. So I think, of course, those off times were important. But even more important was someone or a system that could actually see propaganda in more global terms, in terms of all the instruments that you can use, and then shift the emphasis here and there. So 1939, 1941, there's a lot of political propaganda. Newsreels get longer and longer and longer because they have so much positive stuff to talk about. Victory here, victory there, victory whatever. People want to watch these things. From 43 to 45, newsreel gets shorter, okay, because there's not very much talk about everything. But of course, what happens during that time? Goebbels, who is very much in control of the film industry, pretty much throughout that period, one of his success stories, he says, forget about political films, leisure, entertainment, love stories, big historical productions. The last film, Kohlberg, is a historical production, kind of blockbuster. They understood, even within a leisure activity like a film, you can do both. You have these sliders, and you say, right now we need more of escapism, so we're going to produce more entertainment. But that entertainment is never innocent. It's never an innocent thing. It projects images, and in a system like Nazi propaganda, every choice of a film was centrally approved. So even a love story is not just a love story, it's a love story with an emplotment that serves something else in that respect.
Right, and the in another book that you have, which is a broader book, right? Let me get the title right. Genocide and Fascism: The Eliminationist Drive in Fascist Europe. Yeah, you replace the Nazi political system and the Nazi ideology too, in a broader, what you call, I'm citing here, atmosphere of extreme license that facilitated the leap into eliminationist violence. Okay, so again, in a kind of, I guess, if I understand correctly, an effort to stop singling out and identifying the Nazi system and the Nazi ideology as something totally out of the blue, but within a broader atmosphere in interwar Europe, about the rise of fascism and the fascist parties and sort of extreme outgroup naming, shaming, blaming, and violence. Am I correct in saying this, that there's a that ideology and hence the propaganda takes place in a at the beginning, at least, in what I could say a friendly ideological environment where it's not absurd to have an extremely violent narrative against, the Jews, for example, Jewish people. And if I push the question a little bit further, it leads, I think, to a crucial question when we study that propaganda, which is that between propaganda and the level of violence that actually occurs, the genocide itself against the Jews. It's a perennial debate in sort of propaganda studies. What's the effect of propaganda on violence? But I think it's more complex than that. But can you tell us your thoughts about this kind of these two interrelated questions that I have between the general context, which might be friendly to this enterprise, and also the extreme levels of violence that were in fact kind of justified by this, triggered or accompanied, or some say hidden by this propaganda.
Yeah, the book Genocide and Fascism, it kind of came out about 4 years after the propaganda one, the first edition of the propaganda one, and it was probably the hardest book for me to write because it got really dark. So unlike the Nazi propaganda book, which was focused on Germany, with Genocide and Fascism, I kind of zoom out to my favorite kind of conception of generic fascism. So, you know, National Socialism is a very particular, singular and unique, but not uniquely unique in a way that it's different, very different in many ways, component, and a very important one, of a much broader intellectual, ideological and political universe. And what I actually found very, very interesting is that there is a lot of political learning going on in Europe in the 1930s in particular, 1920s to an extent, but particularly 1930s. There are new kind of examples appearing. 1922, Mussolini comes to power, and his regime becomes an alternative to the kind of appears in the eyes of many people as an alternative to either democratic liberalism, parliamentary democracy, so on and so forth, or sort of socialist revolutionary regime. So it's a kind of there is a different way. You can actually do it in that way. And it becomes deeply influential, and you can see immediately people start cherry picking. So you have in 1923 you have a dictatorship in Spain by Miguel Primo de Rivera, who is not a fascist. He's an old military, older generation military general. He's very religious and so on and so forth. But he immediately learns from Mussolini. He visits Mussolini. He's the first political leader to visit Mussolini and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's this kind of political learning that's happening already. When the Nazis come to power, that's another paradigm that people can look at. So you have a regime that's quite radical, quite dynamic, quite modern, quite efficient, into inverted commas, in a number of ways. You know, the way in which the Nazis dealt with the opposition, for example, however horrendous we may find it today, at the time of paranoia against the left by broad sections of the political spectrum, including not just rightists and authoritarians and conservatives, but also liberals sometimes, quite a few times, not sometimes. It was just like, whoa. So it was this kind of thing. So Nazism, the experience of Nazi totalitarianism is probably an extreme and warped potentiality within what is otherwise a much broader context, in which this kind of departure from values of liberalism and democracy and freedom and respect for privacy and so on and so forth, which were not anywhere rock solid to begin with at that time, almost go out of the window, receding. I mean, liberalism is in retreat in the mid and late 1930s. It's no longer sexy to be liberal. You know, sexy would be to go and do something rogue, radical, and so on. So it becomes really important. And in that respect, there are elements within fascist ideology, generically speaking, that actually unite the experiences of many of these countries. I always refer to now fascist ideology as an amplifier and an enabler. Amplifier in the sense that fascism is nationalism. So in every country, it will be different because nationalism is different in every country. But what fascism does is it amplifies pre-existing tendencies. So there's substrate of anti-Semitism in Germany and France and Romania, for example. This kind of wave of radical nationalism and fascism in the 1920s and 30s pick this up and take it to extreme and develop it much, much further. There isn't a very strong element of anti-Semitism in Italy prior to this. Of course there is anti-Semitism, but it isn't as central to national identity. look at Italian fascism in the 20s and up to the mid-1930s, not much interest in terms of the Jews. So fascism amplifies the darkest, most exclusive components of that ideology. And in Germany, of course, you get this. It does one more thing as well. It enables, as I call fascists taboo breakers. They are the ones who say, you know what, the nation is our top value. Anything for the nation. So all these taboo things like persecuting people because of their religion, deporting people because of their religion, let alone harming people because of their religion or their ethnicity, are taboos. Every society sees them as very, very different, including Germany, of course, and all the other societies. But what the Nazis are saying is, and again, Emplotment is very useful in that respect, this is a necessary condition in order for this country to be great again. Why? Because I have already constructed the Jew as this enemy of this worldwide existential struggle whose goal is to exterminate and eliminate the German people. So it's either us or them. And that instantly gives the license, and I use that word quite a lot. License is not freedom to kill. It means you can kill. You should kill. Because if you don't kill, you may be killed. And in that respect, the result is unique and extreme and unprecedented, but the processes and the ingredients along the way were not.
That's fascinating. It's very good how you tie this link with violence with the broader kind of context. And another thing that I take from what you just said is this thing which is kind of it seems like a commonality beyond the Nazi ideology when you look at other groups that have been extremely violent in the pursuit of a particular political ideology, which is the depiction of an enemy, right? Which is not only, and there's a lot of literature on that aspect, not only dehumanized as some kind of, underhuman or subhuman group, right? So for example, Germans and the Jews portrayed as animals or parasites, and you have all these stories in propaganda, but also at the same time, this group that is depicted as subhuman, in fact, is also portrayed as a group that has extraordinary powers, okay? So the Jews in Nazi propaganda, tell me if I'm wrong, but they're both at once this subhuman groups of deplorable individuals who have no values, but at the same time, it's an all-powerful clique that is ruling the world and plotting and pulling the strings and directing the capitalists. And so that's a fascinating tension that I find here as I was listening to you, but that I also find in many other instances of an ideology, and each will be different as you explained, but of ideologies that were pushed to the very most extreme in identifying an outgroup that is an enemy, and a tendency of both at once dehumanizing it, but making it some kind of superpower, which is extremely threatening.
Absolutely, and I think the construction of the other is very important in all these regimes, because that other becomes the raison d'etre of yourself. So because of the existence of that, Jean-Paul Sartre has written about the anti-Semite and the Jew, and how the anti-Semite needs the Jew, because without the Jew, the anti-Semite always loses the reference point. So what I would say with regard to this is the image of the other and the construction of that image, which is partly a propaganda, overwhelmingly, I would say, a propaganda thing, it is at the very heart of this process. And I would say something we're saying earlier on, when I said that the propaganda is at its most lethal or effective, whichever way you want to say, when it's pushing an open door or a half open door, is this kind of idea that if you want to construct an enemy, it's very hard to construct a new enemy out of the blue. Very, very hard. There needs to be probably an element of short-term threat, in which case, yes, it may work. So something really tangible and existential. I don't know, an attack by somebody, then yes, okay, you do it. But if you want to create a really powerful and meaningful image of the other, you create this longer story about the other, that it's not just now, it has been for a while, it will be forever, it's part of a wider thing. So you kind of invest them with extraordinary powers and capacities to do harm, and to do harm to you in particular. So suddenly that kind of broad abstract idea of there is another as there is us and everything becomes real and becomes a battle for survival, literally an existential battle. And that, of course, enhances that message one way or another.
And that leads me to my last kind of substantial question for today. And then I have two small ones to wrap up. But when I listen to you, everything that you just said, it's something that in my own research and reading other scholars' research on the same topic, I found to be just there in the propaganda machine set up by the so-called Islamic State. And in our first question and answer, I said we're going to return to that. This idea that in ISIS propaganda, that the Muslim community has always been harmed by what they call, that's sort of eternalizing concept or label, the Crusaders, right? And so that as they say, if I quote, the Crusaders of today are the same as the Crusaders from before, and that now it's the time of the battle in which we can finally get rid of them because they have oppressed us and harmed us for such a long time. That's one thing that I noticed, the kind of same structure. And it's something that has motivated a couple of scholars to start comparing the propaganda of the self-proclaimed Islamic State and the Nazi propaganda. What do you make of this this parallel that is sometimes made in terms of the structure of the message, but also in terms of, and that's what I said, we're going to come back to this perhaps, the ability of these two groups, very different ideologically, organizationally, historically, but their ability to, as you would say, push a half-open door in terms of people's grievances, but also in terms of the technologies that are at hand. The Nazis would sort of say, "Oh, cinema is a new thing. I mean, kind of new thing. Let's go for it, right? Radio is there, and it's starting to be a mass media. Let's invest that." The Islamic State, on the other hand, social media is the new thing. We do this. Short YouTube kind of videos are, what matters now. Let's do it, right? So there's that parallel that's often done. And I have a sub question starting from this. Sorry, it's a lot, but I think it's very interesting. This parallel has pushed some people to call for more effort to get the international community to get the hands of the international community on the key propagandists of the Islamic State, to put them into trial in a way that echoes not only what happened after the Rwandan genocide and the famous media case, but also in something that was considered by many as a founding moment, which is in the Nuremberg trial, the indictment of Julius Streicher, one of the propagandists that who was active in the Nazi system. So just if you can, these are vast questions, but if you have thoughts on these, both at once the similarities and differences, and this idea that it somehow makes sense to bring propagandists to trial, not just for hate speech, but for genocide or crimes against humanities.
It's a very interesting question. I have to confess that Obviously, I will defer entirely to your expertise on the so-called Islamic State. So we may see it differently. But one thing I would say is, because I'm a comparativist by instinct more than anything else. I tend to love comparisons anyway. So even if the historian in me, historians tend to be very methodologically individualistic. Everything is different, and every little case study is different, and everything is not comparable. It shouldn't be comparable to something else. I'm not in this category. So I'm fascinated by comparison, even if the return of that comparison is a lot of the similarities. I'm always looking at patterns. I'm always looking at mechanisms. I'm always looking at processes that, for example, may be very interesting. So yes, the ideology couldn't be more different in some respects, you could say, but I mean, I could pick out a number of other things. For example, Nazi propaganda was striving for consensus much more than the propaganda of Daesh in that respect. The propaganda of Daesh is geared to an audience to have very different messages to the audience. So, it's speaking, some of it is speaking to the faithful, some of it is speaking to provoke to an audience that's going to see it on social media from so-called the enemy. I think the Nazi propaganda was subtler in that respect. It was, and this is a general thing about the Nazi regime in general, it avoided harsh dilemmas. So the example I would use in that respect is during the war, there was a film that was made, and that film was it was a social film. It was I Accuse is the translation, and it's basically a story of a couple. The woman is critically ill, dying, and the husband is caring, seeing his wife suffering, and he thinks, would it not be good if there was a way to put her out of her misery? Now that's the time that the Nazi regime is putting forward its so-called, in the background though, the euthanasia campaign. So the film is knows that this is a taboo topic, and it kind of treads really, really lightly, and never really says it because the film is inconclusive. It doesn't say, this is what should happen, whatever. So this kind of subtlety, this kind of attempt not to cause a rupture with your audience, not to provoke, not to contest, but to kind of push that door, and then at the same time sneak in that slightly different idea. So I would say in that respect, that is very, quite different. But of course, it would be different. The modernity of it, I absolutely agree with you. And in many ways, I find it exactly the same, because essentially what the Nazis did in the 1920s, particularly the 20s and later in the 30s, was saying all these new technological opportunities allow me to do things that nobody else has thought about. They allow me to reach audiences, to communicate messages, to fashion messages, to appeal to people. And in that respect, Daesh did it exceptionally well. The use of social media, the targeting of the message for different audiences, for different purposes in that respect, to me is just like phenomenal. This uber modernity. So comparatively speaking, they're very, very comparative in that respect. They're very similar in that respect. So there are a lot of similarities, and I think even the differences are very instructive in so many ways. So this kind of idea of not convincing persuasion that was so central to public opinion, but converting, as in kind of gaining people as an adherent to a cause, to me, it's kind of closer to Nazi propaganda in the mid to late 1930s, when the movement was quite small and more radical, and it was trying to reach out to get people who would go against the grain of society to come and join the party. But very, very much so. The other question, interestingly, I know quite a bit about both cases, and if anything, I probably know more about Radio Television Milcolin in Rwanda. But correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't have time to check this, but I think the Rwanda media case, the charge of genocide was dropped at appeal. So although I think they were put on trial for genocide, incitement to genocide, and so on and so forth.
And they were convicted in first instance.
Convicted in first, but then
there was an appeal,
and they managed to overturn it. It's an interesting one, because I remember teaching Rwandan genocide a few years ago, and the role of the radio station, of course, was crucial. It was pushing an open door, that's for sure. The kind of building blocks have already been there, but of course, you communicate in a much more immediate way, which is not something abstract as part of the language. What I think is very important, and Julius Streicher, for example, of course, that was a trailblazing thing to when the people, the Allies chose representatively the people who would go on trial at Nuremberg. Streicher was exactly for that reason, to represent this kind of mass media propagandist anti-Semitic thing. So he wasn't, in some respects, comparable to a crime that an SS general, for example, would have been involved in that respect. But it was very important, and I think it underlines a very important part in propaganda as a procedure. Propaganda works on the basis of persuading people. What does it mean, persuading people? It means convincing someone to change their attitude or their behavior, or both. Okay. In order to change your attitude, you have to change slightly the way in which you think. And I'm not talking about brainwashing here. I'm talking about small things. How do you convince someone to buy a product? You're trying to make them think, you may need this, or this is maybe better than what you're doing, and so on and so forth. So you kind of speak to them, but at the same time, you're trying to make a little bit of change and to convince them. You try to make and convince them in that respect. So the verbal, the discursive, is that part of not just making people decide something in the short term, but of affecting that long-term choice. The way in which we talk about something is absolutely constitutive of the way in which we think, understand, and in the end also act about it. Language creates habits. And in that respect, those people, whether it is the Nazi propaganda machinery in Nazi Germany, or the propaganda radio station, TV stations, whether it's Rwanda or Bosnia or so on and so forth, are absolutely critical to the process that creates, at the end of that, the attitudinal change that breeds violence. It's difficult to establish the connection. That's why that case in Rwanda, of course,
absolutely
falls. But to anyone who understands propaganda, it's not that it's part of a process, that verbal construction and the communication. It is the building block that unlocks all these radical possibilities. It doesn't make them deterministically to happen, but it unlocks all these radical possibilities. So in that respect, it's absolutely crucial.
It's, I mean, there are so many things that I would like to continue discussing with you, but unfortunately we have to wrap up, because we have to kind of have this format. I would like to wrap up though with two very, very quick questions that have nothing to do with Nazi propaganda. It's more to do with you and your research agenda. If you can very, very briefly answer these. So, first of all, what are you currently working on? Because I think you moved away from this, I think, or perhaps this period of time or this topic. So what are you working on now, and why do you think that's important that you work on this, or someone works on this now? And the second question is, I ask everyone the same sort of last two questions, is what would be, if you have to single out one book on, that's very difficult, I know, but one book, I mean, we cannot read every single book, so if we have to organize our reading list, what would be the book that you would put first? A book on propaganda, extremism, that kind of topic?
The final question is the more difficult one. But what am I working on? I've always been intellectually very promiscuous, so I cannot really work for too long on one thing. So I'm working on quite a few things, but if I can single out the two more important ones, is I am researching a book that hopefully is going to come out at some point at the end of next year. It's about fascism and iconoclasm. So this kind of idea of, and again, you can see connections. So I haven't left this period at all. I'm kind of going back and forth. Iconoclasm is a kind of symbolic violence. So the attraction is there. And I use a very, very broad term. Iconoclasm is not just breaking down something, it's actually deconstructing. So it could be an image of the other at the same time. So this is one thing, and it's a comparative one. The other thing, which is driven by a lot of projects, but it's something that I've been playing with for a long time. And it's one of those things that I'm trying. I'm working on a project that is dealing with mainstreaming fascism. So essentially what I'm trying, this is the title, and it's a very problematic term, but I have a problem. We know pretty well what fascism is. We know pretty well all these things, or radicalism, or extremism, or whatever. It's difficult to define them, but we can sort of define them. But usually we juxtapose something called mainstream, and we have no bloody idea as to what this mainstream is. So we tend to think that this mainstream is kind of some kind of beautiful liberal society when everybody's tolerant and respectful or whatever. And I'm trying to say that that kind of distinction does not work anymore. That in many ways, we've been through, this interview is a kind of in the shadow of what happened a month and a bit ago in the United States, okay? The storming of the Capitol and everything. You can say, how is that even possible? How is that even possible? Because that distinction between a radicalism and extremism on the one hand and the mainstream on the other does not exist. They bleed into each other. They have dialogues, they have overlaps, they have all this kind of inner potentiality. So it's part of a much bigger project, and I hope it comes through because it absolutely fascinates me now. Oh, the book you said as well.
You were trying to escape the question on the book.
No, I wasn't. I'm going to. I actually thought about this a bit. It's very, very difficult. So I'm not going to cheat, but I'm going to offer a book that ticks a lot of boxes. And it's a long book and it's an old book. But I remembered there are 2 or 3 books in my life that when I read them, I said, wow. And almost I said that wow every 3 or 4 pages. And sadly, I haven't written any such book, and probably I will never be able to. But Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism. It blew me away. It's what now, 60, probably even close 70 years. A massive book, but fascism, tick. Totalitarianism, tick. Extremism, tick. Mass violence, tick. Holocaust, tick. Propaganda, tick. Anti-Semitism, tick. In a book that is so intellectually thick, but also rewarding, that if you let yourself go with it and don't take it as, oh, I have to read it in, it's massive, okay? To say, I've got to read it in a week. No, take your time. Take your time. It drags you in, and every page almost becomes an opportunity to write something. And I think it's one of those books that changed the way in which I understand the world. And that is a pretty tall claim.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely amazing book. So also hugely influential in other fields. In many different fields. And so that indeed builds on what you were saying about the richness of that book. Yeah. Excellent. Well, on that note, I can only encourage our audience to go and immerse themselves, as you would say, in that big, indeed, volume. And I just have to thank you again for taking part in this and for agreeing to discuss and enrich the discussion. So thanks a lot. And I wish you all the best for your 2 big projects.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this, and my apologies to your students for having for you having inflicted my work on them. So I apologize in advance. Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and cite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet,
to ensure that such events never occur again. preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.